Look at this. It doesn't touch the ground. So this was simply a counterweight, probably some structural benefit, but a counterweight to the windmill itself. So yes, it could turn up there. Notice how this had something to do with its control. Of course, is the bottom of the grinding system, but what was that barrel for? They were able to control something by hand. Notice it had a belt here, and there's the pulley system right there. Can't go up, but it's pretty essentially what we saw before. What's interesting here is this huge beam. Must have been an old growth forest when they did this. This is the Ritsley farm. It's how they locked that upper part of that post in. The normal way, or the way often used in Europe, of securing the bottom of it. Barn dwelling would imply people lived in it and stored stuff in it. Don't know what that is. Here we come to the Rusi farm complex and other buildings nearby. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, the foundation of stone. Is this the add-on portion, or is the portion down there supported in the more primitive way on rocks, the original, or is that a granary just attached to this building? They've peaked the ends of the building is interesting. There had to be a practical reason for that. Notice the hole up there. Don't see it in this other building. Notice this architectural design feature of the curve just for aesthetics purposes. This was built when our West was young. And how a pioneer from Oregon in the 1880s might have thought if they could have been quickly transported here to see how these folks lived in their log homes, would they have adopted this very practical oven and heating system? Whitewashing of the wood would not necessarily have surprised them. Those that had the money might do that. An intimate little bedroom with its own desk. It looks like it's an iron stove top embedded in this. I think that's an innovation I hadn't seen before. This rock have served as a purpose next to the stove. Shop kindling in the wintertime. Speaks of living in a bunch, because in addition to the one person living in that room, here's a single or double bed, several mattresses, if you will, piled up there. Here, this might have been the paddock. First impression of this series of buildings is they're quite modern. That could be a consequence of restored logs. Also the framed roof with the shingle type that we've seen in Riga, I believe. I don't know if we'll get greater access to this substantial complex. This is interesting. Other than a kid's swing, what could it be? In Riga, Latvia, swings were part of the tradition, as were dyeing eggs, so perhaps the same thing is true here. Major significant difference is the great use of stone. And perhaps this is the true front entrance to the complex. The roof design and that niche up there, and then these detailed windows certainly suggest this was a time when more money and time was available for artistic expression. Also obvious how privacy was an important consideration, and maybe even security. Coping looks machined. This dates from 1877, but I don't think they had machines for making that kind of a cope. But the reaction I'm looking at this building as I approached it was that it was like one of those log homes that you buy and assemble quickly, where all the logs are milled and coped in advance. This is not quite to that degree, but it somewhat reflects it. This was a yoke for some kind of imagine a man buying a kit like this from somewhere, having it shipped to him, and then building the rest out himself. So both rooms on the sides of this house had those big ovens and stoves. Just kind of looked in, we'll look at it from this side. The sign points out that these things were almost built fortress-like. It doesn't suggest, however, why that might have been necessary, other than style. To be honest, this to me lacks authenticity, seemingly somewhat later than 1870, maybe more like 1930s. Pretty little house, still evidencing a fair amount of rock work, a great bit of detail on the windows, which is very pretty. Local, authentic wildlife. It's interesting because it gives us a nice sense of what the original community might have been. This may be quite possible all this detail was redone, hopefully in exactly the same style. Kind of gutter. What's interesting, are they using that chain to kind of prompt the water to flow straight down the chain into a drainage area? We'll enter this, what appears to be a totally new constructed barn. Relatively modern windows with views of Tallinn off in the distance. As I pan to the right, we're visiting an old fisherman's complex. Seem to look at this very old coping. Maybe they had a technique for doing that. And it's a temporary building, which is interesting since it's pretty substantial. The fact that they've made a table. This may have been an original table, but got a feeling it was just something they made with the extra logs. Interesting stove. Modern, of course. Claims to be late 19th century. That'd be the late 1800s. So perhaps I'm wrong and they had that kind of coping technique. It's an erratic. These were net storage sheds. It's drying. Those rings were either weights or attachment point for weights. The wood dowel attachment devices. An interesting method for holding down the peak of the roof. Into this complex, and then we'll go up and visit those windmills. This wall construction. Why heavy rock there? Probably to support that entrance block. This land, wherever there is rock exposed, seems to be this sedimentary layered rock. Purpose of the stone floored room was, don't know. If the door designs were indigenous. House, again late 1800s. It looks like it would be ideal as a granary, but it has a chimney, so who knows. What's interesting is the buildings we're seeing today, the small entryways.